As I would sometimes describe myself, I'm just a simple country parson from North Carolina. And it was an adventure coming here from Washington over the last 2 days through the storm. But it's great to be here and to join you this afternoon. Rick, thank you for the wonderful introduction. You know, it was just a few years back when I had all my hair and that we met there in the early 80s. So what I'd like to present today is kind of the core of the work that Kara does and the research that we're engaged with. And a lot of that is to provide the context, the change, and the hope for the Catholic Church in the United States today. So there are 3 parts to this presentation. The first one, kind of putting these in a series of questions, of who are these Catholics and where are they coming from? The second part is how are they engaged with the Church? And the third one is what is important to them? How do they understand what the Church is teaching? And I'm going to try and frame this a little bit in terms of my Jesuit life. I entered the Jesuits right from the nursery. So I'm 55 years a Jesuit this year, 45 years a priest. So I'm going to frame this kind of in the 45 years as a priest as we go along. Next slide. So this first one is really a snapshot of the Catholic community. Next slide. And so the question to look at, as I put it, who are these Catholics and where are they coming from? And this would, in a sense, in my experience as a Jesuit priest, this is my life as being a bureaucrat in the Church. And so some of it began when I did my studies in public administration, trying to, how to be a better pastor, how to engage the local community with people in needs. I was a pastor in Appalachia at the time. But from that, I ended up becoming the director of planning in the Diocese of Charlotte. And Charlotte was the home missions. We had about 45,000 Catholics in Charlotte in the 1980s. Today, there's over 500,000. So 40 years, from 45,000 to 500,000. Huge change over those years. And then later on, I was the executive secretary at the Jesuit Conference for the United States in Washington, our national office there. And in those 9 years, a lot of it was dealing with how do we reconfigure the Jesuit provinces. We went from 10 to 4, and a lot of the works that were related to that. So this was a lot of more my priestly ministry being a bureaucrat, as I would put it. Next slide. Here's a snapshot of the Catholic population. When we look at this, when we say, if you're baptized a Catholic, you're a Catholic, period. It doesn't matter whether you ever show up again at church or anything else. You're a Catholic. But that would be over 110 million people in the United States. But this includes a lot of well-known figures who have never identified as Catholic. Ronald Reagan was a baptized Catholic. He never identified. There's a whole string of other folks there. So what we go to as a sociologist are the self-identified Catholics. When a surveyor asks the question, what religious group do you identify with, do you belong to? And they say, I'm Catholic. So in the United States, it's about 73 million Catholics. In the Church's formal counting in the directory, it usually comes up more like 66, 68 million. So there's about 10% that don't even show up when we ask in parishes or dioceses. But keep that in mind, 73 million Catholics. Say they are Catholic. And then we come down to, do you attend Mass at least at Christmas and Easter? We've dropped now to 52 million. 20 million self-identified Catholics never darken the door of a church. 20 million. So this is like 30% of all Catholics. And then when we ask, do you attend Mass at least once a month? And we get to about 32 million, so it's a little less than half, would be monthly attenders. And for Cara, at this point in more recent years, this is the level of an active Catholic, that you show up to Mass at least once a month. As I would say, that usually means that individual knows the name of their parish and hopefully knows the name of their pastor, but not necessarily a lot more. And then we get down to the weekly Mass attenders. It's about 17, 18 million, or about 22, 23% of the Catholics fall into that category. This is really important when we're watching media narratives, other discussions about the Catholic community in the United States. 73 million Catholics. But there's a big difference between those who are engaged and those who are very engaged in the church itself. The next slide, please. Up in this room, I didn't think it would be this big, so I don't think you can quite see this. If you come down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from the top is the Catholic bar, and the number at the end is 57%. This is the retention rate among religious denominations in the United States. This is done by the Pew Foundation regularly. And the two questions they ask: what were you raised as growing up? What are you today? List them all down here. So when we get this, what we find, those that are higher than the Catholics are Hindus, Muslims, Jews, nuns, Orthodox Christians. But for the denominational groups, they're all very small groups in the United States, those communities. Following Catholics are Baptists with 54%, then Mormons, 54%, Lutherans, and it goes lower and lower. What's key here, often enough we'll hear it said that the second largest religious body in the United States is former Catholics. And this is framed and presented as if the church is going to hell in a handbasket, that it's all falling apart. 73 million Catholics. The Baptists are barely making 15 million. They're the second largest. Catholics are 5 times bigger than the second largest denomination. It doesn't take a lot of Catholics, former Catholics, to be bigger than the Southern Baptist and everyone else. That context gets left out of the narrative. And when we look at that retention rate, what we find among the major Christian denominational groups is that Catholics have the highest retention of anyone. And that gets left out. That there's this constant movement and churning among religious bodies in the United States, and has been this way for decades. Now, 10 years ago, that Catholic number wouldn't have been 57, it probably would have been about 62%. So this retention rate has been declining across the board. And it's not just Catholics, it's pretty much everyone there. The United States has become a less religious body or nation overall. But it highlights this piece of, for the Catholic community, yes, there are a lot of former Catholics, but primarily because we're the biggest by 5 of any religious denomination. Next, please. This is looking at a breakdown of the Catholic population over the last 70 years. And so we have the 4 census regions of the country. So the Midwest begins with Ohio. Somebody used to say the Midwest really was the Cuyahoga River. So if you were on the east side, you were part of the Northeast. But you see the differences here. So when we go back to 1950, close to a majority of Catholics lived in the Northeast, 30% in the Midwest, only 12% in the South or West. When we come to 70 years later, the Northeast has dropped to 28, the Midwest to 19%, the West is now 27%, the South 26%. If I had updated this to 2025, the South is now the location of the largest number of Catholics in the nation. So it's about 29% at this point. Now, as a boy growing up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, there was a fraction of 1% of Catholics in the whole state. It was the least Catholic area of the nation in those years. So the diocese, when I came, again, Charlotte in 1981, 40,000 Catholics. Take the whole state together, less than 100,000. Today, there's well over 1 million. So that's the growth just in the 45 years there in North Carolina. So what we have is, we forget the Catholic population is very mobile. And Catholics move. And so we can be here in Cleveland, or if we go to Buffalo or Syracuse, and a pastor looks out and says, you know, I don't have as many people. What am I doing wrong? And the thing is, you're not doing anything wrong. The church has been very successful in the schools that are set up, and all these young people went on to college, and they got a great job in Houston. And they got a great job in Atlanta, you know, or Phoenix, or whatever. So it's this movement, and we're just not paying attention that there's just a huge movement of Catholics from the Northeast and the Midwest to the South and West. When I was a pastor in North Carolina, the number one place I would ask at a Sunday Mass, or visiting at a parish, I'd say, those adults who were born in North Carolina, stand up. And we get like 2 people. You know, have 600 people at Mass, only 2 were native born. You know, and when you start asking, Michigan at that time tended to be the biggest state, then Ohio, then New York, you know, and you go down the line. So we keep forgetting just how much people move. And that movement of people underlies a lot of the challenges that the churches have in the United States today. Next slide, please. So here's a quick evidence of this. This is dioceses with the largest increase in Catholic population just between 2010 and 2020. So just those 10 years. Increase has been going on beforehand, they're still continuing. Phoenix, over 500,000 new Catholics in 10 years. St. Petersburg, 400,000. Atlanta, 300,000. Charlotte, where I used to serve, 300,000, going all the way down. Just in those 10 years. And note that it's all in the South and the West. And these are just the top 10. So a big change. But to keep this in perspective on the planning side, with the church and the challenges, if we divided up the Catholic population among the Catholic parishes of the United States, 73 million people among about 16,000 parishes, there'd be about 5,000 Catholics or less per parish. Phoenix, 500,000 Catholics in 10 years. The Bishop of Phoenix, if he was on the ball, should have opened 10 parishes each year for 10 years. 1 parish, brand new parish, every month, practically. Well, it's impossible. It's just impossible. It can't be done. But that's the movement of people. So the challenge across that part of the nation is, how do we just build the parishes? And often enough, people are not engaged in a parish because they can't get in the parking lot. They cannot get in the parking lot. It's hard for us to conceive of that. But go visit in Dallas or Houston or Phoenix, and you'll see that reality. And parishes, their pastors will say, we bought land, we added 100 new parking spaces, and within the month, people were still complaining. You know, it's just that big of a transition on it. The next slide, please. And here would be the diocese with the largest decrease over the same 10 years. And again, the decreases were going on beforehand and afterwards. But here for Chicago, 400,000 fewer Catholics in 10 years. Philadelphia, 300,000. Los Angeles is here with 300,000. That's a lot of that is with housing prices and commuting. Those people have moved to San Diego, to Orange, San Bernardino, that are all the outer suburbs also of Los Angeles. So really, they don't quite belong there in that way. But you see Newark, Boston, Fall River, Springfield, Baltimore, Erie. So Los Angeles and Baltimore is part of the South, kind of are outliers to it. But we see this movement of people coming out. This isn't that Catholics all died or that they all denied the faith and went someplace else. No, they moved down to Phoenix. They moved to Miami, wherever. But in the same point, when we look at that 5,000 Catholics to a parish average, you would turn around and say, just in those 10 years, in Chicago, did you close 80 parishes, or 80 here? In Philadelphia, did you close 70 parishes? No, they're not on that way. But you have this great movement of people out. The Archbishop of Baltimore, when he announced the reconfiguration of parishes, he got in the opening part of the news story, which I was appreciative of. He said, we have, I'm going to blank on it, 30 parishes in the city of Baltimore. We have less than 6,000 people coming to Mass on a given weekend. It doesn't work. You can't have all these parishes with just 100 people in a city where you could walk to the next parish and go. So he kind of framed it in terms, the population has moved. We have to find a way to reconfigure and deal with this realistically. Next slide. And so with the Catholic population, so I think for so many of us, the challenge is we can think of the church and our church community as being stable. Here it is, this is who we are, this is what we've been, and this is our present day, our future, and think of this in a very stable way. But the Catholic community is all but stable. So in this graphic is kind of highlighting that the green bar arrow going across, this is kind of the life cycle of a Catholic community. First thing we note, the red arrow going up on the left, these are the leavers who are under 18. So in our survey data and collecting it, we find that often enough, it's in the teenage years that a young man or woman will say, I don't believe this. I'm not Catholic. And also we find in the survey, that's not what their parents think. So mom and dad say, no, they're Catholic. Our children are all Catholic. When you're able to survey the children separately, you'll forget a different story. So, but you do have a notable grouping of teenagers who are they disassociate themselves from the church and the faith. And then before they get to 18, we also have what we'd call reverts. So a convert is somebody who enters the church, a revert is somebody who's coming back. And there's a notable number. I'm 13 years old, I'm not going to be Catholic. Before they turn 18, they come back. Something has happened in high school, so they'll come back. So there's that part that they leave then, and then they'll start to come back. As we move past to the adult period, then we get the adult leavers. Whether you're in college or afterwards, you leave the church. But then we also have the adult reverts coming back. And often enough, marriage, children, kind of switches this focus for many young adults. The key with this in the Catholic community, you're baptized, you are Catholic. If I decide to leave when I'm 16, and at age 26, I come back, I just come back. There's no ritual, there's no nothing, I just come back. I've always been a Catholic. But this, for all my purpose, gets very challenging because how do you measure this? We have to do other ways to try and pick up this flow of what's going on. Then we have, on the two blue arrows coming down, we have immigration coming into the Catholic community. 25% of all adult Catholics in the United States are foreign born, 1/4 of the church. And so a large number of that are Latin American, but it's also Vietnamese, Indian, Kenyan, Nigerian, so Poles, a whole mix there. So immigration is a big deal in the church. And then we have the adult converts coming in. So you have this mix, and there's this kind of churn and flow within the Catholic community. And it's when we imagine ourselves and think of our future, the danger is thinking of ourselves as being stable. You know, we're here, we're this group, we have this identity. You know, it's just not the reality, and it hasn't been the reality for decades. So there's this constant movement in and out, and as a parish, the need to focus back of how do we welcome? How do we welcome? And it's not that we necessarily have to go out and recruit. How do we welcome? There are people showing up all the time in our parishes. How do we welcome and engage them? This flow is going back and forth. When we do the surveys, the reverts will say, well, I went back to St. Mary's, and you know, it was the same awful parish I left. And then they wait 5 years, and then they say, but I went to St. Peter's, and this was exciting. And so there's this movement that's always going on. So it's one to kind of shift our mindset. The Catholic community is very mobile and moving. It is far from being stable. Next, please. So these are the lessons we're learning from this. That Catholics remain about a quarter of the United States population. They no longer live in traditional Catholic areas. And depending where you live, the realities on a Sunday morning are either empty pews or packed parking lots. The church can almost be divided along that northeast, midwest line to the south and west. And they're just profoundly different realities that bishops and pastors, the Catholic communities, have to deal with. And we just need to recognize that piece of it. Next, please. So Catholic engagement in the life of the church. Next one. So how do Catholics engage in their faith? And here I kind of pull on more of my experience of being a pastor. Unlike most Jesuits who are ordained, finish their formal studies, go into academia, and then at age 60 or 70 decide that they're going to go into parish work. I've done the opposite. So when I was ordained, I went into parochial work and spent the first 15 years being more of a pastor, working in a diocese, and then going back to my studies. So when I was made, not formally the pastor, but to initiate the Mars Hill Catholic Community, 1981, Bishop Begley met with me, gave me the 7 known Catholic families, their names, in that part of Madison County, and $3,000, and slapped me on the back and said, partner, come back and tell me how it goes. And I rented an ice cream parlor for $10 a Sunday, and that's where we had Mass. It's now a formal church, St. Andrew's Parish in Mars Hill. But that's how I began. I was 10 weeks ordained. I wouldn't trade the experience for anything. But I wouldn't necessarily advise that that's what you do with the newly ordained priest. And I was pastor at St. Benedict the Moor in Winston-Salem for a number of years, pastor in St. Peter's in Charlotte, and then assisted in parishes. And very happily now, I'm the Catholic chaplain at the Knollwood Military Retirement Center in Washington. And a lot of that, I do lots of funerals. But it's also being the pastor and accompanying the elderly retired military. Next slide, please. So here's on weekly Mass attendance. And we see this trend line, starting as back in 1970, up around 50%, coming down to our own time, which is around 21%. As we go back earlier, a piece to note, those numbers are all a bit inflated. When Gallup first began asking people, polling, it was face-to-face. So, did you go to church on Sunday? Oh, of course I did. Then it came by telephone. Did you go to church on Sunday? Yeah. And it's amazing, the year they went from face-to-face to telephone, church attendance for everybody dropped like 10%. And then when they went from telephone to more online-based, church participation dropped again. So those earlier numbers, that was just what, there never was a time that 70% of people went to Mass. So we have that coming down, so you want to keep that in mind. But we're fairly accurate nowadays in the surveying and data collection. But that kind of shows the difference. But what we see is it's a little bit of a decline, but a little bit every year, year after year on that. Next, please. Here is what I find very distressing, and this is in looking at just the record of sacramental engagement for Catholics across the country. And this, again, is just looking at 10 years, 2014 to 2024. But we found in those 10 years, and note that over those 10 years, we added about 2 million more Catholics. So the population of Catholics had also increased at this time. But we dropped over 700,000 baptisms to just under 500,000. Same number of First Communions. Confirmations, we get a drop. Catholics married in the church, a drop. Adult entries into the church, a drop. Deaths, funerals registered by the church, a drop. That one we have projected out. One of the folks at Cara did this and said, you know, in 2051, Catholics will no longer be dying, according to the trend line. He thought this is what's going to be the good news. But you will see this drop, and it's it's just a disengagement from the sacramental life. We are a sacramental church. And this is essential in our Catholic identity, and people know that and value it. But it's just this disengagement that's been going on. And it's been fairly steady year after year. In last year or two, we've got a number of calls saying, oh, we got all these people in the OCIA, adult converts coming in. We got all these students showing up at university masses. I hope it's all correct. I wouldn't put any money on it, you know, on the statistician side, on the sociological side of it. No, we may see this bump, but we want to see next year. And is this a bump because it's after COVID? Is it whatever? But we want to see the trend. So I'm hopeful when we see these numbers increasing, but that does not make a trend or kind of change the direction we want. So we want to be careful how we embrace that. But at Cara, what we try to get at, what's the explanation? What's going on here? And in a particular way, looking at young adults. Next slide. And so back around 2020, Cara was commissioned by the Porticus Foundation to do this major study of young adults and their spiritual and faith lives. So we wanted to look at 18 to 35-year-olds across the United States. So we did a large national survey of this, followed up with interviews and other focus groups with it. So we got a huge amount of data. So before I jump to the next slide, we had asked the Mass attendants, and what we expected it would be like 15, 18% said they were regular Mass attenders, and we did get that. We also, our big purpose of it was, what's their faith activity though? Not just Mass attendance. What's their faith activity? And here's where we were surprised. Next slide. And in the survey data, when it came back and we asked this first part, have you ever participated in any of the following church-related programs? So these are formal, organized groups. Knights of Columbus, St. Vincent de Paul Society, Charismatic Renewal, on. And we had 37% of these young adults said, oh yeah, I've participated in that. I thought, wow, okay. And then we said, besides attending Mass at your parish, do you participate in any of these other Catholic groups? So it's a Bible study, devotions, faith-sharing groups. And then have you provided, service or assistance, through Catholic charities, other outreach items, and evangelize, spread the faith? And in that we found 46% said yes, they're involved in that. And then we asked on this final piece, in terms of other Catholic faith groups outside of your parish in the attending Mass, and another group said yes. When we combine these together, because some people were doing all three. But altogether, to our great surprise, 60% of those young adults are actively engaged in their faith in one way or another in all these areas. We were thinking, studying this all the time, that we were going to get back like 25% or 30%. We knew there'd be a little more there. We were stunned, kind of rechecking our numbers and data. So what we weren't expecting was that, no, there is quite a bit of faith activity and engagement by young adult Catholics across the country. So this was quite the surprise. Next slide, please. And so when we asked the ones, particularly on the Mass attendance, so these are the people who say they're infrequent Mass attenders. And so, well, why, you're active in your faith in this other way, why aren't you coming to Sunday Mass? Most often cited, missing Mass is busy schedule, lack of time. Next one, not believing Mass is a sin. And then this next one came up was to practice their faith outside the parish. Every time you do a big survey, you'll get an answer like this, and you'll say, oh, could we do it over again? Because knowing that 49%, almost half of them said that, what did they mean? Could we add 4 more questions to figure out what was meant there? Well, every survey, you always get 1 or 2 of these questions where you wish you could go back and add some more. And then followed family responsibilities, not a very religious person. Not a very religious person, but you're engaged in these regular faith activities. Interesting. And then inconvenient Mass schedule. But we see this range of items, and what's telling right off the bat is these are not young adults who are alienated from the church. Now, there's not, when we go down farther, they have a beef or an argument with the church is way down the list. Way down the list. It's a busy schedule. It's, the schedule of the Mass times. We're not believing it's a sin. But somehow, for these young adults, the weekly Mass attendance at a parish just isn't that significant. But I will not miss my Bible study on Wednesday evening. I will not miss my charismatic prayer group on Tuesday morning. They're there for that. But there's just that shift and change. Next, please. And so the observations from it, we're studying this. Kara's been around 62 years. Studying this part is like saying Sunday Mass attendance is a diminishing metric for what makes an active Catholic. It was so handy just to ask that question and you'd have a good measure of people's engagement. Today we're finding more evidence that just is not as strong a metric, particularly among younger adults, that they are very engaged, involved with their church faith activities, but it's not at Sunday Mass. And we're not quite sure why. What's the explanation? And then the other piece from it is realizing that the parish is not the center for faith activity. Many more young people are meeting for a scripture study or faith sharing, at Gold's Gym after they do their workout, rather than at the parish or, at the Starbucks, on a Wednesday afternoon. It's just something different is going on, and having our efforts to try and identify this and say what is it? But it's not that young people have just left their faith. We see that clearly in this, but we're not sure exactly what all is going on here. And so the question we're left with, how and where do we engage? And so it's a question, on the pastoral side of, really thinking, how do we get hold of and engage and get a grip on these young adult Catholics? Next slide. I got to finish up here real quick. So here's a quick look at, we asked this question a little more deeper on people's belief. Next slide. And this is, what do Catholics believe? And as I would describe it, my life as a researcher, crunching numbers for Jesus is the way I put it. And this is based, back in more of my doctoral studies and then my 15 years at Cara and working with groups on different research questions. Next slide. And here's a question we asked. This is in 2021. A national poll, and the importance of the following factors in your sense of what it means to be Catholic. Receiving the Eucharist. So the bars are, the top bar, light color, is the weekly attenders, the middle bar is the once a month at least, and the lower bar is just a few times a year, never. But receiving the Eucharist, 3/4 or more say, no, this is important for me as a Catholic. Those are the weekly Mass attenders. Less so for the monthly attenders, much less for the very irregular. Living my life consistent with church teachings. Again, the weekly Mass attenders, right up there. Less so for the others. Attending Sunday Mass each week, the weekly Mass attenders are there. We see it lower for the others. Here's interesting. Helping the poor. Suddenly they're all in a majority, and it's right up there close together. And so we find there this interesting also connection, relationship between the value of the Eucharist and the value of helping the poor. These are two things that just kind of carry the day for Catholics, even for those who never come and share in the Eucharist. It's linked, it's there. Being involved in my parish, we see that. And I think that linkage between receiving the communion and caring for the poor, I came across, it's a wonderful quote from Mother Teresa. She said, "We must pray to Jesus to give us that tenderness of the Eucharist. Unless we believe and see Jesus in the appearance of bread on the altar, we will not be able to see him in the distressing disguise of the poor." So I think she kind of captures that connection, and it's telling of all the different items. For those Catholics who are not engaged, they still come back and say this is important. So a final piece on this. Next slide, please. If you can get this. This was, Cara did a national poll about the understanding of the Eucharist. And these are 4 statements coming from the Bishops' Conference on understanding of the Eucharist. The big Pew poll that said that Catholics, a large number of Catholics didn't believe in the Eucharist, it was wrong, and they have tacitly acknowledged that. They are not reusing that poll and questions, they just dropped it. They got grief from us, they got grief from everybody on that piece to it. What we looked in this deeper study, just to highlight these different statements concerning the Eucharist, strongly agree, then neither, then somewhat disagree, strongly agree, and don't know. And what often is not asked is that last one, I don't know. So when we give this kind of choice for Catholics in it, what we find is that the majority of Catholics are agreeing on this clearly. What we find is on the disagree, when you look at those 2 columns, is anywhere from 3 to 8%. Very, very few Catholics would disagree with the Church's teaching on the Eucharist. But also a big block simply say, I don't know. I'm in this neither side, or just straight out, I don't know. So some of the challenge when we talk about the Eucharistic year and the focus really is a knowledge piece to it. It's not a disagreement. And just how do we develop people's knowledge and engagement with the Church in that one item. And Cara has done this on national surveys on capital punishment, on environmental justice, on immigration. We're about to launch one this month on racial justice. And what we're finding consistently is if you're a weekly Mass attender, you tend to be aware of what the Church teaches, and you're much more likely to be in agreement. If you're not a weekly Mass attender, you're more likely to be in disagreement, but also you're less likely to even know what the Church teaches, because we ask that, do you know this or does this fit? So it's this piece of knowledge and the confusion that a lack of knowledge does not necessarily mean disagreement, and that often gets caught up in it. So the next one, finish off. So the final thoughts. Context matters. And Kara and all the research we do in trying to understand faith is recognizing what's the context. We want to think about the Catholic community in Cleveland, and we got to recognize that this is not the context of Phoenix. You know, there's a whole nother social, civil reality going on. What's the context? And then also the constancy of change. You know, the change is just going on decade after decade after decade. It's not going to stop. And so we need to recognize and how to engage that effectively for the church. And then for Kara, what we're going to continue to kind of struggle with is how do we understand what it is to be an active Catholic? You know, what are the practices and engagements, the devotions, the religiosity of people? Because we're finding this mass attendance is not holding up, you know, as being that key metric. So it's how do we engage? How do we share knowledge? You know, and what is the practice, just the ordinary devotional practices that so often we find have disappeared? You know, Advent, Lenten devotions in families. And I would come back, you know, if I was back being a pastor, these are two things that I would focus on, and every family in my parish is going to be engaged in this because it communicates so much to the family unit, the children, and in so simple ways that somehow we've lost in our family life. So I'll stop at that and open it up if we have time for questions.
As I mentioned, thoughtful and thought-provoking about the reality of our time. Just a quick thing, all of this is being recorded. So if any of you want to get a better, and the slides will be embedded in the presentation, so you can go over some of the details. We only have time for a couple questions, but knowing Tom, any of you could contact him and he will talk more about a question we don't have time for. So with that, please raise your hand. And Megan?
Right. Hi, Father. Hello. Hi, Father. My name is Megan Lowe's-Bolin. So I am the Director of Young Adult Ministry for our diocese, and I also teach at John Carroll. So first, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I always appreciate numbers and information like this. And my own biased opinion, I love just the young adult pieces as well. So for your data set regarding with the different ministries that young adults are involved in, I'm curious that if it was just individual groups that they were involved with, or was that collectively like a young adult involved with the pro-life movement and Knights of Columbus and other groups?
What we found is that there are a lot in kind of formal groups, but there's just a large amount of very informal. It's just 5 friends who get together after they go to the gym for Bible study. There's nobody organizing it. There's nothing to it, I mean, in that way. So that was our surprise, is how much of this is kind of not institutionalized. And it's a good and a bad. You know, it cuts both ways on that.
Thank you, Father.
In the back?
Father, Annalise Nader. You mentioned that 60% of young adults are actively engaged. That is a national number. How is it if you think of the Southwest versus Northeast and Midwest?
Oh, I think we may have something on there. I was not one of the direct researchers in this. These are the questions I always dread. You know, if Dr. Gray was here, he'd know the answer right away. My guess is that there would be, you know, it would follow probably a little more active in the South and West. And part of it is simply there are more young adults proportionally in the population, as there are more older, elderly Catholics in the Northeast and Midwest. So it's the best I can do. The book is for sale.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Father. I guess my question comes as maybe I'm something of a representative of the Gen Z Catholics, but I've seen it reported over the last couple of months that for the first time in American history, among Generation Z, Catholics actually outnumber Protestants within my generation. Does CARA have data that backs that up, or do you think there's any merit to that statement?
Yeah, I saw that. I'd have to go back and look exactly how they calculated that. It doesn't quite make sense, but it could be just, more of a methodological way to it and how they're going to measure. Catholics tend to keep better numbers than others, so sometimes it's just the way the question was asked or how. But I saw the headline and I thought that doesn't resonate with the data we've been collecting. But maybe a big miracle has happened. I can always hope.
One more question over there. Thank you.
Women have long been the backbone of the church, the nitty-gritties of parish life. Do any of your studies do a gender breakdown of women versus men and their attitudes and practices? My intuition is there's an awful lot of alienation felt by women in the church, and I wonder how much of an effect that has on parish life.
It has a huge impact because the women parishioners are going to be much more active and engaged in the local parishes. They're almost the entire source in terms of religious education in parishes. Is overwhelmingly women engaged in that. And that becomes the key piece, and what is sometimes missing or absent, as you may have fewer younger women who may be stepping in. Years ago, I was at an academic conference, and it was a big study that was being done in the Archdiocese of Boston that began about their closing of parishes and the impact just when all the sex abuse exploded in Boston. And in their survey data from dozens and dozens of parishes, they were looking at it. There was a psychologist doing it, and it was studying the traumatic experience of that on the parishioners in Boston. And then what they were detailing is on this kind of spectrum is the more progressive parishioners were like, okay, yeah, that always happens, the church is always doing that. The most conservative parishioners, were, it's those, liberal bishops or whatever, or priests. What they found is this trauma, the most deeply affected group in the Archdiocese of Boston were women who would have been just a little right of center. And I'm listening to it, and tended to be the middle-aged women. And I'm there, and I just thought, that's the backbone of the church. Parishes only survive because of all these Catholic lay women, often enough aged from 35 to 60, who show up for everything and are doing everything, providing all that, and here they're documenting this is the group most traumatized and alienated, in the Archdiocese of Boston. So that has stuck with me over the years, and I think it's a tragic situation there, but it's also a learning for us. How do we address this, but also in terms of the church, of the acknowledgement of just how critical our pastoral life and the communication of faith is by the women in the parish.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thank you. And